Watch out. Uncle Derek's back in town and he's trying to sell you some Garbo. That's all well and good, but around these parts, Garbo sounds a bit too much like Garbane. And we all know what happened to the last guy who tried to push some Garbane to the public. Space Invaders. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may have even played it, and then some of you may have even eaten them.
It's raw! You fucking idiot!
Since 1978, with the release of the original arcade game, Taito has churned out over 1 trillion Space Invaders for over 1 billion platforms across millions of different formats, and we've covered some of these on this here channel over the past decade plus. God shoot me. So color me surprised when, in all this time, we never actually touched on Space Invaders on Atari 2600, released in 1980 from Atari. And from most accounts, this was the first coin-op game to grace a home video game platform, and Space Invaders became quite the killer app for the old VCS. Space Invaders' concept is as old as time itself. You shoot the invaders out of the sky before they land, using the shields as cover while they last. Invaders move quicker as their numbers start to dwindle, which makes timing your shots a bit difficult, especially with the slower shots of this Atari version. Every so often, a little mothership flies by that you could shoot down for bonus points. It's all familiar fare, it works about as well as you expect it to work, minus some constraints. But the point is that if you've played one vintage Space Invaders game, this is pretty much that, and then some. And then some comes in the form of multiple game variations that the game throws your way, which is where the real value of this port lies. You've got about 16 single-player modes and 96 different two-player modes for a total of 112 game variations, which employs various rules and modes into the mix. You want to play a game with guided missiles, moving shields, no shields, invisible invaders, some combination of the above for a true challenge? Find yourself a list of these things to see which playstyle fits your style and have fun. Toggle the difficulty switch to determine the size of your turret, either the default blaster or a more obese version that's just a bigger target. I think this game is trying to say something here, but I'm not sure what. These game variations generally add a bit of flavor to your stock Space Invaders offering, and it's much appreciated in that regard. But it also helps to make up for the fact that this port of Space Invaders comes off as somewhat bootleg. You have different invader types that don't resemble the original arcade versions, you have far fewer but much larger invaders on screen, which means less room to maneuver, you don't have the familiar Space Invaders droning, and the sound effects are just your stock Atari sound effects that you've heard in plenty of other Atari games, your shots are a bit slower compared to most other ports. Generally speaking, this 2600 conversion is the farthest thing from arcade accurate. Some would go so far as to compare this to something like the later Pac-Man port that would grace the 2600, which is being a bit stupid because Space Invaders on 2600 isn't actually terrible. Taken as its own thing, Space Invaders on 2600 is fairly straightforward shooter fare with a fairly straightforward premise that's pretty simple to understand. Controls are simplistic, responsive, and easy enough to grasp. But as an adaptation of the arcade Space Invaders, while there are some differences here and there, what made the transition relatively intact is the core gameplay, and that hasn't gone off the beaten path as much as some other Atari ports of other games would have. The overall premise, the general idea, remains the same, and underneath the low-tech stuff, this is still Space Invaders for better or worse. So yeah, this might not be the most true-to-arcade conversion ever conceived, but it's still a great little game with different playstyles to give it a little flavor, and it still holds up as one of the better Atari 2600 carts. Dare I say, I had more fun playing this version of Space Invaders than I did the arcade original, and that's not something I would say often. All in all, Space Invaders on 2600 is top-notch and well worth checking out.